Dean. Let's see. Harold, good to see you. Hi, Carly. Nice to see you. David. There she is. Okay. All right. I'm glad you're both there. I was worried for a minute. Deborah, you're getting along, right? No one's answering. Okay. All right. Risa, where's Stan?
Grocery shopping.
He's grocery shopping. Okay.
He should be back.
All right. Wendy, welcome from Northern California. Glad you're here. Hey, Ellen. I don't know where Mark is, but we're glad you're here. Dana, Merle, everybody. Let me see who else. Who I haven't seen. If your picture's not up, I can't say hi to you because I can't tell if you know. Susan, good to see you. All right. I see Aviva's here, but not her camera. Okay. You guys, there we go. Don't, Maxine, good to see you too. Hi, Maxine. Maxine, you look like a rapper with that beanie on. I like it. All right. We have, as I often say, but it's always true, an amazing Torah portion to talk about this morning. So many important lessons and interesting connections. So we're just going to jump in. And for those of you who have, if you have a Bible in front of you, get it, hear you, get it. Otherwise, you can use your phone. If you have another device with you, an iPad, a phone, whatever. We're going to start with Genesis chapter 23, verse 1. That's the beginning of the Parshat, Chayei Sara. 23:1, Genesis 23:1. So we'll just give everybody a second. Okay. All right. So let's jump in. Chayei Sara. If you know the blessings, please join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. La'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, who hallows us with mitzvot and commands us to busy ourselves, to be busy with words of Torah. So here we go. Vayehiyu Chayei Sara. 100 shana ve'esrim. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. So let's just start. We could spend the entire time just on that sentence. But let me riff on a few important ideas just in those first very, very few words. First of all, Sarah's the only woman in the Torah whose age is mentioned. And it's mentioned twice. Once when she gives birth to Isaac, which is at the age of 90. He's called Isaac because it comes from the Hebrew word to laugh, because she laughs when God informs her she'll be having a child at the age of 90. And here on the day of her death, she is 127. Now, why is this important? First of all, the fact that she's the only woman whose age is mentioned tells you something about her significance. But in addition to that, the rabbis use this as a way to shed what I think is a very interesting light on last week's Parsha, the binding of Isaac. When we think about that story of the binding of Isaac, when we close our eyes and imagine it, almost all of us imagine Isaac as a little boy, right? The Hebrews say he's a na'ar, a youth, but we really don't know. His age isn't given at the time of the Akedah. And most of us, when we imagine the story, we think of him as a little boy. Some of the rabbis use Sarah's age at 127 and the fact that he was born when she was 90 to claim that Isaac was 37 years old at the time of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac. He was not an innocent young child obeying his father. He was a 37-year-old man who was a willing participant in the Akedah. Now they get to this idea that he was 37 because they say the reason Sarah died was she heard what Abraham almost did to their son Isaac. This is all fiction, by the way. but it's fiction with a purpose. And the purpose is to get us to think differently about the Akedah and differently about Isaac's role, that he was a willing participant. He too was faithful is one way to look at it. Or you could look at it in a more pejorative way, which is, here's this 37-year-old man who's a willing victim of his father's fanaticism, and he won't speak up and speak out against his father. And any of us with strong fathers know what a challenge that can be at any age, including 37 or 7. But I just raise it as one example of how the rabbis use this unique aspect of Rebecca in the Torah, of Sarah in the Torah, to help us reimagine that terrible Akedah scene. Okay. Now let's go. So she dies. Okay. This is the first Jewish death. And so some of Jewish mourning custom gets developed in this very first example of what we learn, how Abraham proceeds. So we know that he takes the time to mourn, that you don't just rush back. And we know that he saw it as his responsibility to find a burial place for her. And this is another, sorry, I've just got to let someone in. This is another really interesting historical moment. So Abraham needs to find a burial place. And so he enters into negotiation with the locals to buy property to bury his wife. This is very often in history, the first Jewish purchase in a community as a Jewish community is the cemetery. Los Angeles, by the way, Wilshire Boulevard Temple began in 1862 as the result of a small group of 8 families getting together to bury the first Jew who died in Los Angeles. They had to become a community when the first Jew died. They had to get together. They had to buy a cemetery property. They had to have a burial. They had to have Shiva and grieve as a community. So it was death that brought them together. Wilshire Boulevard Temple was founded by those very same families that created that first Jewish cemetery, which, by the way, was in Chavez Ravine, where the parking lot of Dodger Stadium is now. And then they moved it to Home of Peace in Downey, which the temple owned. So here you have the first Jewish burial, and you have Abraham buying this piece of property. There's this very engaging Middle Eastern bargaining scene that goes on, which is familiar to anybody of the day who was listening to the text. And remember, they only listened, they didn't read the text. And then Abraham buys this property where? In Hebron, in Hebron. Hebron exists today. It is on the West Bank, and it is still a point of extreme tension and conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. There are still settlers in Hebron, a small number of them, mostly fanatical Americans, who require hundreds of young Israeli men and women to protect them. And it all goes back to this moment in Torah when Abraham buys this first piece of Jewish property in what we now know as the West Bank or the territories. And with very rare exception, Jews have lived in Hebron for 3,000 years. This is really well articulated in, is it Robert Johnson? The History of the Jews by, last name is Johnson, might be Robert, I can't remember. He, in his introduction, he talks about this moment in Hebron. It's well worth reading, it's just a page or two. So this is where it all started. This is where the trouble began. By the way, as another aside, very often people ask me about being buried in a mausoleum, and is it okay because it's above ground? Here we have the first Jewish burial in a cave above ground. So there is precedent for those of you who may own property in a mausoleum and are worried about it, it was good enough for Sarah. Okay. Now, as soon as Abraham mourns and buries Sarah, he pivots and he starts thinking about the future and realizes it's time for his son to be married. It's time for him to find a wife for his son, Isaac. So let's go to verse 20, chapter 24, for those of you who are following along. Abraham was old and well advanced in years, and Adonai had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham now said to his slave, the elder of his household, who had oversight over all that was his, "Put your hand under my thigh, so that I may have you swear by Adonai, God of heaven and God of earth." So anytime in Torah, you have one man putting his hand under the thigh, which is a euphemism, because the way you swore on earth back then was you actually held the person you were making the promise to, you held that man by the testicles. This is where the word testify comes from, by the way. And there was nothing sexual about it. It was making a promise, in essence, on the core of a person's future and identity and life. The sort of the center of his being. So it is of the highest order of magnitude. So the servant swears that he'll go to the land of Abraham's birth. He doesn't want Isaac marrying a local girl. He wants him to marry someone from the land of his birth. And the servant makes this promise. And he asks, "How will I know?" And Abraham says, "You'll know. God will show you the way." I find something very endearing about this because it's what most parents say to their millennial children when they ask the same question. Both of my kids have asked that question. How will I know? And my answer is really Abraham's answer to the servant, which seems so unsatisfying, except it happens to be true, which is, you'll know. You'll just know. And then, of course, your kids come back to you later and say, "You remember that time you said I would just know?" It's true. You just know. So you have that kind of vibe, for lack of a better word. Jeff, you have a question?
What's interesting in this discussion is that Abraham says, "I do not want a wife for my son from the Canaanite women." And yet the paganism of the Canaanites is similarly reflected in Haran and that family. They had not committed to Judaism, and yet he goes back for a girl from a pagan family.
Well, I don't think it's a question of paganism as much as it is geography. Because remember, the religion of the wife in this period of Jewish history was completely irrelevant. Moses married non-Jews, Abraham married non-Jews. It was irrelevant because women were property. So what he's really looking for, I think, is a cultural fit, not a religious fit, because the religion of your wives was completely irrelevant. Judaism back then was patrilineal in terms of descent. It doesn't become matrilineal until the Romans start raping and pillaging, and we don't know who the fathers are sometime, and the rabbis changed the law to be matrilineal rather than patrilineal, because back then, at least, you always knew who the mother was. Today with surrogacy, it's a little more complex. But back then, once Jewish women were being raped by Romans, then the law changed and it became matrilineal descent. As long as we're off on this tangent, that is, by the way, the reason the Reform movement considers either parent sufficient to determine the Jewish identity of the child, father or mother or Jew. As long as there's one Jewish parent, the child in Reform Judaism is considered to be a Jew, based on this idea that Judaism at one point was patrilineal in its descent, in terms of descent and status, and then became matrilineal. So the Reform movement about 35 years ago said, if both were okay historically, let's make them both okay now, as an opportunity to keep people within the fold. Okay, now, so off he goes, And let's go to verse 10, 24:10. The slave then took 10 of his master's camels, and laden with an abundant store of his master's goods, he got up and went to Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city at the water well. Now those words, at the water well, okay? El Be'er Hamayim, at the water well, are extremely significant in the Torah. They indicate what literary critics, beginning with Robert Alter, called a type scene, Type, a type scene in the Torah. This is a motif in the Torah. Anytime you have a man approaching a well in the Torah, somebody's going to get married. Okay, it was a clear sign to the listener of 3,000 years ago. Oh, we know this is just like if you were watching a romantic comedy and the violins start playing. Everybody knows what's happening. Okay, so this is a type scene. Now, that might not sound very revolutionary to you, but the idea of Torah as a document that is literature, that has within it literary devices, that has motifs and type scenes, this was a revolutionary idea 200 years ago. You know, that there's a narrative arc here, that it's literature. Big idea of the Enlightenment. So Robert Alter wrote a book called The Art of Biblical Narrative, where he lays this out really well. But anyway, we now know somebody's going to hook up with somebody here at the well, because that's what always happens when you go to the well. Okay, it's like when your kids were teenagers and they went to Century City Mall. You know, no good could come of that, that's for sure. Okay, so what happens? He brings his camels, and now I want to go to verse 13. Here I am standing at the water fount, and the daughters of the townspeople are going forth to draw water. The girl to whom I say, tip your pitcher and let me drink, and who replies, drink and let me water your camels too, let her be the one. Now, why is that significant? The one who says, let me give you a drink and let me water your camels too. Anybody have a feeling about why that might be a significant character trait that he's looking for?
She's
Claudia,
generous.
go ahead.
She's generous. We're talking about a lot of water if they are, having the camels.
We're talking about a lot of work. We're talking about a lot of water. And we're talking about a person who cares not only about human beings, but also about animals. So it's really a kindness test. And she passes the test not because she's beautiful, although she is, but because she's kind. And I've given that speech at bar and bat mitzvahs to these kids 100 times or more, that Judaism privileges kindness over physical beauty. To be beautiful on the outside is nice. To be beautiful on the inside is essential. And here you have this paradigm created here. Before he was done praying, Rebecca, who had been born, okay, so let's talk about Rebecca now, the name Rebecca. Okay. There are many ways in which this story is linked to the story of the binding of Isaac and Isaac's life and Isaac's childhood. And the ways in which this is also bound to Abraham. So the name Rebecca comes from the word to be bound. And what did we have last week? The binding of Isaac. So at least in her name, although we don't really know her life story about her childhood, at least in name, she seems to have experienced some kind of similar constriction, restraint, limit, sacrifice. We're not sure what, but in name, she is connected to the Akedah, to the binding of Isaac. I do not think this is the least bit coincidental or accidental. And we've got writers on. David's a writer. I think you would agree with me. It's just too good to be random, right? Now, the next connection, verse 17. The slave ran toward her and said, "Let me sip a little water from your pitcher." And she replied, "Drink." And quickly she lowered, etc., etc. So this idea of running toward goes back to Abraham with the angels when they came to visit in his tent 2 Torah portions ago, when they came to say that Sarah was going to have this child Isaac. So again, you have these literary devices connecting these stories, okay? And what does this young girl do? She takes him home to meet the family, the servant. They have a conversation. It has to be volitional. And she says, "I will go." And this is very similar to when we meet Abraham. Does anyone remember the first commandment, the first words God speaks to Abraham? 2 Torah portions ago. It's the name of the Torah portion.
Lech lecha.
Lech lecha, go forth. Go forth. And she says, Elech, I'll go. Same exact verb. So just as Abraham was setting off on this adventure to an unknown place for an previously unknown God, Rebecca is doing exactly the same thing with the very same language. Again, I think sort of indicating she has the right spirit. And is the right person. And so off she goes. If you want to see where that is, by the way, look at Genesis 24:58. Vayikra'u leRivka vayomru eleha hetalchi im ha'ish hazeh. Do you want to go with this man? Vatomer elech. And she says, I'll go. Elech, like lech lecha. Same verb. Same family, same adventure. And the same unknown. So they sent her off. I'm now verse 59. They sent their sister Rebecca off with her nurse, with Abraham's slave, and with his men, bestowing this blessing upon Rebecca. Sister, may you become thousands of myriads. Again, what was the promise made to Abraham? That his descendants would become as the stars in the sky or the sands of the sea. Again, just these stories are knitted together so perfectly. Rebecca's name means to be bound, the binding of Isaac, the running forward of the servant, the way Abraham ran toward the angels, the way Abraham is commanded lech lecha, and Rebecca says elech, I will go. Sister, may become thousands of myriads, may your descendants take possession of the gates of their foes. This, by the way, is very commonly the first verse of a bedekin ceremony, the veiling ceremony that takes place before the bride and groom get married. Traditionally, the groom is the one to lower the veil over the bride because he has to check to make sure it's her. This goes back to the story of Jacob, who is deceived by his father-in-law into marrying the older sister rather than the younger sister that he's in love with. It's a case of mistaken identity and deception. And so from then on, grooms have checked to make sure they're marrying the right woman. And these are the words, because as we're about to see, she lowers a veil over her face. So they get on the camels and they go. Now let's go to verse 62. And I'm just going to read this through because I think it's so beautiful, and then we'll talk about it. Everybody with me, verse 62, chapter 24. Now Isaac was coming from the approach to Be'er Lacharoi, for he was living in the area of the Negev. So he's out walking. I'm assuming he's brokenhearted over the loss of his mother. Going out toward evening to stroll in the field, Isaac looked up and he saw camels coming. And Rebecca looked up, seeing Isaac. She got off the camel and she said to the slave, "Who is this man striding in the field, coming to meet us?" "He is my master," said the slave. Taking a veil, she covered herself. The slave then told Isaac all that he had done. Now notice, Abraham is missing from this entirely. This is really this move now to the next generation. He's absent. Now this beautiful verse, and I want us all to pay really close attention to the syntax, to the order of the words. And Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother, Sarah. Not Isaac, not Abraham, Sarah. He took Rebecca, and she became his wife. Now, he took her is probably a euphemism for they had intercourse, and that made you married back then. And she became his wife, and he loved her. Okay? Vayikach et Rivka, vatihi lo leisha, v'ye'ehaveha. V'ye'ehaveha. It's a beautiful word. Now, you know the game I like to play. What's the sermon? So what's the sermon of this syntax? And I think it's very deliberate. He took her into the tent of his mother, Sarah. He took Rebecca, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Someone help me with the sermon. You just unmute and go for it. If
he loved her after he married her.
That's right. And so what? Why is that interesting?
Well, love grows then, and it's also a confirmation of marriage and fidelity and caring for the other person.
Yeah. So normally, how do we think about love?
Comes first, and
Right.
love, marriage, and the baby carriage.
Exactly. First comes love, right? Daddy and mommy sitting in a tree, KISSING. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes daddy with the baby carriage, right? That's the way we tend to think about these things. But any of us who have been married on this Zoom for a year or 5 or 10 or 30 or 50, we know a different story. We know, look, I'm going to write about this for my Shabbat message, I think. We all know it takes a certain kind of chemistry to spark a romance. But it takes something not completely, but something much more seasoned and mature and weather-beaten and real to make a marriage. That the kind of love we experience after decades with someone is very different than the kind of love we experience at the beginning of a relationship. And I think, first of all, I know the word choice, the syntax is deliberate. The author of this verse could have reversed the order. He took her as his wife. He took Rebecca, and then she became his wife, and he loved her. I think it's beautiful that love is at the end of the sentence, not the beginning. Others may disagree, but that's how I see it. Yeah, go ahead. Penina. Unmute, though. You have to unmute.
Okay,
There
now?
you go. Yeah, we got you.
All right. When Eliezer went to find Rebecca, and
Yeah.
he came to, after he was given the water and the camels were given the water, her brother was there, Lavan.
That's right.
And when he actually asked Lavan for Rebecca, but Lavan said, let's ask the young woman.
Yes, it is volitional. Will you go with them? And she says, Elech.
That's right. So
Right.
they're showing here that first of all, she was brought up with her brother who considered her opinion, and she had some kind of standing in the family.
Yeah.
And the fact that she said, I will go, showed that she had the will of her own, and she decided to do that. And then, so Sarah was a very independent woman. She had her own tent in Hebron. She left Abraham after Isaac, after the thing of the Akedah, this incident. And she actually didn't come back. She was on her own in Hebron, in her own tent. She had her own domain. So she was a very powerful woman. She had her will of her own. And I think Rebecca, in character, probably was maybe a little bit similar to Sarah. She had a will of her own, and she was a strong woman, and she decided that that's what she wanted.
We know this is true later when she, I think, makes a terrible parenting decision, but
Yes.
definitely a willful decision
That's right.
to, privilege Jacob over Esau and
Yes.
to deceive
Yes.
their blind and ailing father. So she was definitely a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet.
Exactly.
Not always morally necessarily, but definitely a strong, independent woman.
Yeah.
And I like it that it's yet another connection between Sarah and Rivka. And I think there are just so many.
May I chime in?
Yeah, please.
After he says, after the Bible says he loved her, then he says Isaac was consoled after his mother's death. And I think that's also a foreshadowing of sort of Rebecca taking Sarah's place in the narrative as, the strong woman.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And you get that immediately where is the first place he takes her? Into his mother's tent. So I think, Claudia, that's absolutely right. And the fact that Abraham is not a part of this at all. It's almost like parallel lanes that don't intersect at this point, which you have to think was pretty unusual given the era when the patriarch would have determined everything. So it's a very independent, to Penina's point. It seems that Isaac is also quite independent here. Now, that might be for very obvious reasons, because his father recently tried to murder him. So it's not that surprising that they parted ways. And as a matter of fact, Isaac and Abraham, they never speak again after the Akedah. They are never together again in the Torah until Abraham's funeral. So Isaac shows up at his father's funeral, but after the Akedah, the dysfunction is just too great, and they don't speak at all. They never spoke before either. The Akedah is the only time that father and son spoke to each other. So I find that terribly sad. I think it's yet another indication of how gifted Abraham was as a leader and how flawed he was as a father. Great at the office, terrible at home, to put it in contemporary terms. And I mean terrible. But that is an old story, unfortunately.
A reflection of the Old Testament God as well. So,
how do you mean that, Wendy?
well, because he's not cuddly, warm and cuddly, the Old Testament God. He's hard, and he's not, he's not easy on his children, if you will.
Yes.
So
Yes.
in some ways, Abraham is reflecting that same type of paternalism.
Yes, I think that's right. And, you know, things do get better through the generations, but the dysfunction continues for 3.5 generations to follow. It's a hard cycle to break. That's for sure. So I think, you know, partly to what Panina was getting at, you're starting to see here how women move to the forefront of the narrative in the Torah. They are actually the catalyst for action. It's not really the men. Now, those of us, again, who've been married for a decade or 2 or 3 or 5, this is not news to us. But it's not. I mean, really, in my marriage, every really difficult decision, really difficult, was made by Betsy. And I'm okay with that. And I don't think we're unique in that regard. So, but here you start to see women moving to becoming the catalyst for action in the narrative. And it's certainly true of Rebecca. Isaac's a relatively passive figure in the Torah. And the fact that later, in a couple of weeks, when we start to read about Jacob and Esau, the fact that Jacob ends up becoming the next patriarch is directly the result of Rebecca's intervention, and some would say manipulation. There's no question about it. And so again, you know, Abraham is not so passive, but Isaac is a very passive figure in the Torah. And we see this established right at the Akedah when he just goes, whether as a child or a 37-year-old man. Talia, go ahead. Nice and loud.
It's interesting because last week when or maybe it was Monday, but we spoke about the very challenging topic of how right to choose in like Jewish law.
Yeah.
So
Right.
with this, it's almost like if life is so honored in Judaism,
Yes.
and the woman is the one who can bear. I mean, I know that we find it so fascinating that like the male seahorse carries the little eggs and breeds the babies, and it's like, well, if human females have the ability to bear the child, then that should give that kind of austerity, if that's the right word, to women.
Authority. Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
So
they have it. They definitely have it. And honestly, I don't think that's a shocking revelation to any of us. And look, the only thing I can tell you is that you have to remember, as the sort of counterbalance, men did have multiple wives at this period in Jewish history, and men did control property, the money in the property. And so I don't want to overstate the case either. Women moved to the forefront in terms of determining familial roles, in the privileging of the younger son over the older. But there's still a lot of male privilege in the Torah, without a doubt. This is part of the reason that women take control in a, I don't mean this pejoratively. I'm not sure you can say manipulative without it sounding pejorative, but I don't mean it pejoratively. They have to manipulate in order to exercise their power in a way that men in the Torah do not. Men can exercise their power more directly, and this doesn't really change. Jeff, go ahead. Unmute.
It's interesting in this regard, in that God creates a separate covenant through circumcision with the male. But even in the Garden of Eden, that covenant with women is struck in the fact that they are the genetic carriers of all humanity and civilization going forward. You will give birth. And that right to give birth and carry on family and civilization is more or less the covenant and promise that women receive, which is stated early, but never again.
Well, I'll tell you how right I think you are. Who knows the very first commandment in the Torah? The very first time, the very first "thou shalt."
Be fruitful and multiply.
Exactly. Pru or vu. Be fruitful and multiply is the first commandment in the Torah. which obviously is, I think, female-centric. So I see we have Judith Reichman on here, who is a legendary OBGYN in Los Angeles and the world. So Judith, you went into the right business. That's what else can I tell you? It's where all the power is. So good for you. Okay. Any other questions or comments? I'm going to flip to my second screen just to make sure everybody's.
You know what you sound like throughout this discussion?
I'm sorry. What, Jeff?
You know what you sound like? A
What?
Deuteronomic historian.
Like a what?
A Deuteronomic historian. The
Yeah.
analyzers in words of the structure of the Torah.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
putting it in human terms rather than divine intervention terms. And it resonates.
yeah, I don't think there's any question that the Torah is about the human condition. That's for sure. Now let's go back. Let's go back into the text to just wrap it up, and then we'll have a few minutes. Maybe we can take just some general questions if anyone has them. Let's go to the end. Let's go to 25:7. For those of you who are following in the text, 25:7. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life. He lived 175 years. So this is pretty common that men's ages are revealed in the Torah, but it's only done for Sarah in terms of women. Abraham breathed his last and died in good old age, full of age, and was gathered to his people. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, facing Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar, the Hittite. So he's buried in the very same cave that he purchased for Sarah. The field that Abraham bought from the Hittites. There, Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. After the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived near Be'er Lahai Roi. So I think you have this beautiful, what the literary critic would call inclusio. Inclusio is, for example, a poem that begins and ends with the same line. Psalms sometimes begin and end with the same line. It's a sort of bookend literary rhetorical device. And here you have it here, because what's the first thing Abraham does in the Parsha is he buys this cave to bury his wife in. How does the Parsha end? He's buried in the very cave next to that very wife at the end of his life. So it's clearly it's a literary whole, a piece and a whole at one and the same time. It's crafted, it's well constructed. It has this beautiful notion of lifelong love and of being together in death and in life. And this moving on to the next generation, this moving forward. And the ways in which both Isaac and Rebecca, by name and by circumstance and experience, are literally bound. I mean, she really was the right woman for him. I see it in the name Rivka, this idea of being constrained or bound, and what Isaac had just been through. My guess is that was their conversation on their first date. That they both talked about the ways in which they had been bound. And she has her father-in-law's spirit. And it says to me that then and now, when people say, you'll just know, you really do just know, and it really does tend to work out if you're willing to put the work in. So anyway, that's my hopeful naivete. Susan, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. Now, Rebecca's name was Rivka. Now,
Rivka, yeah.
Right, but how does that etymologically?
It's from the verb to be contained or to be bound or to be constricted.
Which is?
Well, ravak, resh, bet, kuf. RBK, if I had to say it in English.
Okay. Thank you.
You can Google it.
Yeah, but I didn't know when you then.
Yeah, that's why.
Rebecca sounds more like
Rivka, but it's the resh, the bet or the vet, and the kuf.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
In the last 37 years of Abraham's life, he's married Hagar again, and he has 6 children.
Yes.
Yet there's never a mention or an involvement in the father's burial of these additional 6 children. And it's almost as if the value of his life has disappeared to the next generation. He's no longer in play.
Yeah.
He's not receiving prophecy or doing anything special.
Right.
And I don't know, what that means or why.
I think it means, look, I'll tell you what I think it means. It means that we are not an Abrahamic religion. And I'll tell you how I would proof text that. If you think about the first of the prayers in the Amidah, the Avot, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sara, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Le. So now let's look at that prayer for a moment. It's the prayer in which we say, Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you Adonai, Eloheinu, our God, Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, and the God of our ancestors. Elohei Avraham, the God of Abraham. Elohei Yitzchak, the God of Isaac. Elohei Yaakov, and the God of Jacob. Now, if you wanted to be efficient with your language, you would have said Elohei Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov. You would not have said Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov. You would have just said the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, instead of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, as if there were 3 different gods. And the rabbis have always understood this to mean, and like every junior rabbi has given this sermon, that we each have to forge our own relationship with God, and we each do have our own relationship with God, that my relationship with God is not the same as someone else's. And that's why the word God is repeated 3 times for each of the patriarchs, rather than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that each generation takes over leadership and creates its own Judaism, creates its own theology, creates its own relationship with God. And then when it's over, the next generation is in charge. So you can sort of proof text it with the Amidah. Go ahead, Wendy.
Well, I think it's a kind of a radical notion at that period of time, because most kings would have governed throughout their lives, and it would only pass to the next generation on their death. I mean, that's been going on for a very long time. So
even more so, it goes to later, it goes to the younger often, which was also contrary to this whole idea of primogenitor, right?
Yeah.
So, Moses was the younger brother. Jacob was the younger brother. Joseph had older brothers.
So you don't go just on you don't get the crown just on the basis of being an accident of birth.
That's correct.
It's a meritocracy or something.
That's correct. And of course, what do the rabbis do to support this change? Well, it was the more learned son who became the next patriarch. Jacob is called an ish ohel, mean a man of the tent, which is another way of saying a mama's boy. But the rabbis say, oh, he's a man of the tent. What that meant was he stayed home and studied Torah while Esau was out being a jock and hunting and, playing hockey and losing his teeth or whatever he was doing. So there's tons of evidence for the position that you're stating. And I think it's 100% right. Penina.
Okay. When Abraham died, the world around him, it wasn't his bubble only. There were other nations there.
For sure.
They closed his wells. They destroyed the altars.
Yep.
In other words, it was kind of like the end of the Jewish, as we know it at that time, religion. Him believing in the one God that we believe today. And then it would have been the end. But Isaac, we are saying that he was the next patriarch.
It's really Jacob.
He went and he opened up the wells again, and he has reestablished the altars. And those altars were the symbol of where the territory was of this tribe.
Yep.
It started this monotheism thing.
Yep.
So if it would have
exactly.
been for Isaac, it would have been dead.
Yeah.
The whole religion would be gone. And
That's
he's
right.
responsible in re-establishing it.
Yeah. Now, I would say, Panina, from a historical and literary standpoint, what you are articulating is an anachronism. That it was history written by the winners, right? So, but it doesn't really matter. That either way, it's pretty clear that Isaac and not Ishmael, which is what's important from the Jewish perspective, became the patriarch of the Jewish people. And Ishmael, as we know, goes on to be, mythologically at least, the father of Islam, right? So we have these two nations. So anyway, okay, Andrea, I see a note from Andrea. Andrea, where are you?
Hello.
Okay, turn your camera on if you can so we can see you. Andrea is a graduate student at UCLA studying religion, and she has a question for us. So you have lots of rabbis to help you with whatever it is you want to ask us. There you are.
Hello.
Hi, Andrea.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I'm glad you joined our class today.
Yeah, it was very interesting, your discussion.
What's your question?
It's mostly I'm studying, I have to compare two religious traditions with each other. And one of them is the focus of scripture in like a Jewish life, because we studied, I think it's Haredi, like more
Haredi, the more I would say the more literist and fundamentalist stream of Judaism.
Okay, yeah. And I think just in general, I don't have like a question set specifically, but just general questions about how scripture plays a role in like the daily lives of Jewish people, and how like they kind of, from what I know, I don't know if they like, there's a certain extent to which like they conform to the Bible's readings, like how literally they take it.
I would say just very quickly, I would say that this is what you hit on is the real difference between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. And the real difference is that Orthodox Jews are fundamentalists when it comes to understanding scripture or Torah, and believe that every word was spoken by God to Moses and written down, and it is the literal divine revealed word of God. Whereas non-Orthodox Jews see scripture as divinely inspired, but authored by humans. And therefore open to interpretation, open to historical analysis, literary analysis, archaeological analysis, sociological analysis, anthropological analysis. And I think that, this could be a whole graduate level course, but I would also say to you that once you hold that second position, then Jewish law begins to take on a more malleable kind of feel, more responsive, and Jewish law is now granted a vote, but not necessarily a veto when it comes to our everyday decision making in our lives. And that might be sort of the simplest way to do that. Roy, you asked me what translation I'm using. I use the Reform Movements, Union for Reform Judaism, the Torah commentary. I happen to have the women's Torah commentary today because I knew Risa would be watching and it would make her happy. Right? This just proves our whole thesis about women being in charge of society. So, I'm using the Reform Movement's Torah commentary, Roy. It's published by the Union for Reform Judaism. And I believe that the translation in it is the JPS, Jewish Publication Society translation. Stan, am I right about that or no?
Rabbi?
Yes. Wait. I want to hear from Stan. Stan, what translation did they use?
This is the Plout translation.
Yes, but what did Plout use? Didn't he base it off of JPS?
Basing it, yes, but you have this guy, David Stein, who was the expert who revised it. So this is to a degree idiosyncratic.
Got it.
And this is like, I think the third edition, and he keeps changing it. By the way, not always well. But
Yeah.
if you,
Yeah, but so the foundational translation would be the Jewish Publication Society translation, and
Yeah.
this is a slightly amended version of that translation.
it says used and adapted.
Yeah,
Very good.
whatever that means. Yeah, yeah.
Rabbi?
Yeah. Okay, we have time for one more, and then unfortunately I have to run. Miriam, go ahead. Unmute. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say something briefly about what Rabbi Stan just said. The JPS publication, this is just a personal statement, I find it disturbing to me. Why? Because it paraphrases the sentence. And when I read it, that's just me, I need an exact translation of every Hebrew word because I'm looking for the shoresh, I'm looking for the root of the Hebrew word. And I've studied a great deal of Hebrew since I'm 5 years old, yeshiva and all that. Therefore, I need a translation which translates the sentence. I find the JPS translation does not do that. Thank you.
Yep. I agree with you. It's different if you know the Hebrew. Chaim Bialik, the great Hebrew poet, said that reading Hebrew in translation is like kissing someone through a used handkerchief. All right, now everyone, unfortunately, I'm so sorry, Sandy, I see you waving your hand, and Judith, but I have another Zoom. I'm so sorry. All this means is you have to come back for the next one. Also, I'm going to be talking more about this tonight at our Shabbat service, 6 o'clock. Just go to the temple website and you can watch. I want to wish you all a beautiful, beautiful Shabbos. God knows we need it. Take a breath. Don't watch the news. Get off of social media. Take a walk. Call a friend. Enjoy your family. Okay? Unplug this Shabbat. Enough already with the anxiety in this country. That is my sermon.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Shabbat shalom, everyone.
I love the rabbi's advice. I'm going to call a friend right now. That's what I want. Wish them Shabbat shalom.
Have a wonderful Shabbat and enjoy the day.